Now let's look at a demo where we're going to create a SharePoint Framework adaptive card extension using the basic card template that displays items in a SharePoint list and enables the user to also add items to that list. Developing adaptive card extensions for Viva Connections requires a Microsoft 365 tenant, SharePoint Online, and Viva Connections that are all set up in your tenant. You're also going to need the necessary developer tools installed on your workstation. This includes everything you need for creating SharePoint Framework components for the SharePoint Framework. That includes the Yeoman generator for SharePoint, which has two dependencies, the LTS version of Node.js, the Gulp CLI, and Yeoman installed. You can refer to the Microsoft Learning module that's associated with this screencast for links on where you can set up your environment. You're also going to need a text editor, and we'll be using Visual Studio Code in this example. The first step that we're going to need is to create a new SharePoint list to hold some data that we're going to display in our component. So I'm going to do this by going to my SharePoint site. I'm going to then select Add and create a new list. I'm going to name my blank list my ACE data. And then I'm just going to add another column to it for a description. Now, once I've created the item on this list, let's add a couple items to it. So we'll just add, let's do this in the grid view. So we'll just say item 1, and the color will be blue. We'll have item 2, green, and then item 3 will be purple description. Now that I've got some data that I can work with, let's now go create a project that we can use. So I'm going to go ahead and open up VS Code, and I'm going to jump to a folder where I want to create my project. And I'll jump into that folder. Now, I'm going to run the SharePoint Yeoman generator by executing the following command: yo@Microsoft/SharePoint. Now, when prompted, it's going to ask me a couple questions. I'm going to accept the default solution name, but for the client-side component type to create, I'm going to choose an adaptive card extension. And then I'm going to choose the template I want to use is the base card template. And I'm going to name my extension SharePoint REST, because what I'm going to do is build an adaptive card extension that is going to get data from a SharePoint list and display it in the ACE, as well as give me the option to create data in the ACE. So I'll go ahead and let this finish. Now, after the Yeoman generator provisioned the folders and the files that are required for the project, it then installed all the dependency packages by running npm install automatically. And when npm completed downloading all the dependencies, I went ahead and opened up the project in Visual Studio Code. Now, let's take a minute and let's explore the default adaptive card extension project experience and understand how the project works. So in the console, I'm going to open up a new console here and run gulp serve no browser. What this will do is this will build our project and spin up a local web server that's going to serve up our adaptive card extension. Now, I'm going to jump over to my SharePoint site, and let's go ahead and duplicate this. And I'm going to go to our hosted workbench. That's at _layouts/workbench.aspx in the existing site that we're in. So I'm going to go ahead and add the adaptive card extension by clicking on the plus icon in the toolbar and select my SharePoint REST. Now, just like a SharePoint Framework web part, I can take my mouse and I can hover over it and select the pencil icon to open up the adaptive card extension's property pane. I can close the property pane by just clicking on this little X in the top right corner. But unlike SharePoint Framework web parts, ACEs behave a little differently when the page is in edit or display mode. So currently the page is in edit mode. I can switch it over to the display mode to interact with it in display mode by clicking on the preview button in this top right corner of the navigation. And this is what my user would see when everything is rendered. Notice all the edit tools on the side of the canvas and in the ACE component, those are no longer visible. Now, the default view of an ACE is the card view, and it's selectable and also contain buttons. The default ACE, if I jump back over to the preview mode, The default ACE is going to open up a link in a new tab when it's selected. You can see it's just popping up the Bing search engine. This is implemented in a specific file. So let me jump back over to my project and let's open up the cardview.ts file. So here, if I look at the on-card selection method, you can see that what this does is it says that when I click on the card or select the card, it's going to fire this method, which is going to return an object back, which is the action that I want it to perform. And in this case, I want it to perform the action of external link. And then the parameter I'm passing in is the URL where I want it to go ahead and what page I want it to open up to. Now, card views can also contain 1, 2, or no buttons. 2 buttons are only going to show when the card size is set to large. The buttons on a card view are implemented using the card actions method that you see here. This method can return 1 or 2 buttons, and then the object that's returned by this method determines what happens when the button is selected. So, like, for example, in the project's default code, you notice that it's opening up a quick view. So it's open. The action says open up a quick view, and the parameter I'm passing in, the view is pointing to the quick view ID that I want it to open. And I can see it if I come back over to the browser. If I click this button, you can see the quick view is opening up. Now, quick views are implemented using 2 files and registering it with the ACE component. The rendering of the quick view is defined in a JSON file that you see right here in this template subfolder. This contains the definition of an adaptive card. And the JSON file for the default project's quick view is what you see here. Notice that I have a text block showing up at the top, and then I've got a column set that just has a single column listed of a single item that says is just the title or the subtitle of the item of the current adaptive card. So this is one object being passed in, and then there's another object that's being passed in. This is using the templating capability we have in adaptive card extensions. So we can see the titles being rendered at first. There's the title called SharePoint REST, which is also in the card view. And then the subtitle is not being shown here because we're going to pass in a different value when we in the data in one of the methods it's going to return that back. We'll look at that in just a few minutes. Now, the quick view is actually defined. The one that we're looking at here is defined in this quickview.ts file. So let's take a look at this. This file gives the SharePoint framework the JSON for the adaptive card that's used in the rendering. And you can see that here from the template method. It's pointing to that specific JSON file or the contents of that JSON file, which are read in when I call the required method. All card views and quick views, they must be registered with their respective navigators in the ACE component. And this is typically implemented using the onInit method in the ACE component. So if I go over to my adaptive card extension, which is right here in the adaptive card extension file, what you can see here is I've got my 2 IDs that I'm defining, one for the card view and one for the quick view. And then inside of the onInit method for my adaptive card extension, I'm then registering those 2 views. And I'm doing that within the onInit. Now, I want to take this project and make it a little more dynamic where I can read and write data to a SharePoint list. So let's add a SharePoint REST service to the project that's going to handle all reading and writing to the SharePoint list that I've just created. So I'm going to go into my SharePoint REST folder right here and create a new file called spservice.ts and just paste in some code. Now this code's got a few methods here. I've got an interface that I'm defining at the very top. So one called iListItem. And then I've got a method I'm returning called fetchListTitle. And then another method that I'm going to return called fetchListItems. And then I have a couple other ones I'm going to use a little bit later. One for adding a list item and then one for getting an entity ID. We're just pasting this in because reading and writing to a SharePoint list has, there's nothing unique about it. When it comes to working with an adaptive card extension, you're going to use all the same concepts and capabilities that we have and requirements that we have when I'm working with any other kind of component inside the SharePoint framework. Now that the project has some core dependencies that have been added, let's now implement the initialization of some core features when the adaptive card extension is going to first load on the page. And this involves configuring the state of the ACE and enabling the user to set the ID of the SharePoint list to read and write from and to. So I'm first going to go through and update the adaptive card extension to enable the user to set the SharePoint list ID. So I'm going to do that by coming over to the adaptive card extension, and in the interface for the extension, I'm going to go to the list ID, and I'm going to go to the interface and add in a new property called list ID. Now I'm next going to go over to our property pane class. So if I scroll down a little bit, you can see that when I go get the property pane configuration, I'm going to be returning back a method called get property pane configuration. It's coming from this deferred property pane. And if I scroll up, you can see that my private member here called deferred property pane is of type SharePoint REST property pane. And that's defined right here in this file, SharePoint REST property pane. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in another property here. And this is going to be set to the list ID, and the label for it will be set to list ID GUID. When I set the list ID, I'm going to want to go fetch all the items out of the SharePoint list. So let's go set up a little placeholder method that we're going to update in a little bit. So what I'm going to do is add a new method here, or a new event handler here, called onPropertyPane field changed. And what this does is that the SharePoint framework is going to raise this event when the value of a property in the property pane changes. We're going to come back and we're going to update this method in a little bit later. Now, the next thing I need to do is I need to update the state of the adaptive card extension and the initial view. So what I'm going to do is come up to the top here, and let's add in an import statement. And we're going to want to import from our SharePoint list service. So we want to pull in the fetch title, the fetch items, and the iList item as well. Now we're getting some warnings here because we're not using any of these, and that's okay. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. Now, if I come down here to the state, let's go set a few things. I want to set a state property for the title of the list. I'm going to want to set one for the items in the list. And the current index in the list. I'm going to initialize the state property in the existing onInit method. And I'm going to do that by replacing my existing state assignment here. And the reason for that is because this object no longer represents what a state looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the current index equal to 0. The list title is going to be equal to an empty string, and the list items is going to be equal to nothing. Now, the current index, we're going to use this to kind of cycle through all the items we get back from the SharePoint list and know which one we're supposed to be looking at in the card view or in the quick view. We're going to do that in a little bit. Now, the next thing I want to do is I'm going to want to add in some code before we complete the initialization to go try and fetch the values out of our SharePoint list if we have a list ID. So I'll say if the property on our adaptive card extension list ID, if it's set, then what I'm going to do is I want to go do two things. I want to run two methods. They're both asynchronous. And so to make sure that this is asynchronous, I'll have to set this up to add the async keyword to use my promises here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I want to call this.setState equal to, and I'm going to set the list title equal to await the fetch list title method. And I'm going to pass in the context of the current, the page context, which is how I'm going to get a reference to the SharePoint HTTP client that the SharePoint framework has to be able to make my call to the SharePoint REST API. And then I'm also going to pass in the list ID. In fact, I'll just make this, I'll put all this on one line like this. And then I'm basically going to want to do the exact same thing, but instead of for the list title, I want to set it for the items on the list. And I'm going to say fetch the list items and pass in the exact same value. Okay, so now when my component initializes, it's going to start by initializing the state to nothing. I'm going to register my two card views, my card view and my quick view. And then if I've got the list ID set, I'm going to want to go update, go fetch the title of the list and go fetch the state of the list as well. So now all the public properties and the state are all configured for the ACE component. I need to handle one more case, such as when the user updates the list ID property in the property pane. So what I'm going to do is come back down to that method that we created earlier. In fact, I'm going to go grab these two lines here of the set state. We're going to use those in a second. And what I'm going to do is I'm checking to see if the list ID is the property that was updated. And if it was, then what I want to check to see is if I have a new value that's defined, then what I'm going to do is I want to run my async methods. So I'm going to do that by wrapping them up in this IFI, and I'll just paste them in like this. And then otherwise, I'm going to want to set those two state values. Actually, I don't need to do it for both of them like this. I'll just say like list title is going to be nothing, and the list items will be set to an empty string or an empty array. Like that. And we then need to close our our else statement. So at this point, our ACE component is reading the title and the items in the SharePoint list. So the last step to be able to see this work is to display the information that it's going to render. So let's do this by coming over to our card view. And I'm going to make some changes to our card view. So I want to update the existing data method right here to do some additional things with this. So how am I going to do this? Well, what I want to do is I'm going to change the title of our card view. Instead of it showing, I'll leave the title the same. But for the primary text, I'm going to want to change this. I want to say, check to see, is the state list title, is this defined? And if it is, then I want to say view items in the, and let's just write out the title, this.state.list title list. Otherwise, if it's not, then I'm going to say I'm missing the list ID. So you have to go through and specify the list ID as in the property pane so that my user has a little bit of context on what they're supposed to do. Now in the card selection method, I'm going to change this to go launch a quick view instead of what I'm currently doing. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to set this to a quick view, and I'm going to pass in the view parameter of a quick view registry right here that's being imported. So at the top here, I'm actually importing this. Kind of hard to see without this wrapping, but let's go fix that. There we go. So what you can see here is I'm pulling in the quick view ID from our component that is where it was being registered. Now, the last thing I want to do is, because I don't think I'm using the strings anywhere. I guess I'm using it right here, right now. Yes, we'll just leave this as is. Now that we've done this, let's go update our adaptive card for the quick view to display the data from the SharePoint list as some sort of a carousel. So I'm going to come over here to my quick view. Actually, let's go to the JSON template. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace everything in this with some different JSON, with some different code here. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set up in a column set, I'm going to display an image. So I'm going to have like a previous and next image on either side. So this is just an SVG image that is a vector graphic that's going to have like an arrow pointing to the left. And then for a previous button, or there you go, previous button. And then I'll have one a little bit farther down for pointing to the right. So that's just a different image. Both of these you can see are both set to, when they're selected, I'm actually going to call the action.submit and set the ID to 1. What that's going to do is I'm going to use that number as a way to increment the current index of the item I'm looking at. And when I go previous, I'm going to come back over here and just use the -1 to go back one item in my index. And that current index we're going to keep track of. Notice also I've got this property here called isVisible. I'm setting it to be bound to a property called previous enabled. And then farther down, I'm going to check to see if next is enabled. Because if I'm at the beginning of my array, there should not be a previous button. And if I'm at the end of the collection of all the items I've retrieved, there should not be a next button. We're not going to do like a wraparound kind of a capability here. And then in the main part of my card here, you can see where I'm writing out the ID and the title of the SharePoint list item and the description of the SharePoint list item as well. So now that I've got the rendering defined, I now need to go update the class that defines my quick view. So I'm going to go first up to the top and update my import statement. So one of the first things I'm going to need, like to break these up on separate lines to make it easier to read this. What I'm going to need is an iActions arguments that are passed in. And then I'm also going to need a reference to my interface for a list item. Okay, now that we have both of those, the next thing I want to do is I'm going to want to go through and define the data that's going to be returned back to the, or used to bind to my adaptive card. So if you recall, we've got a title and a description of the ID property. Well, all of those are defined on my list item. So I'm just going to have this extend my iList item. Then next up, I want to go through and add in a couple properties here, take away the subtitle and the title because we're not using those anymore. But what I do want to do is I want to have my previous enabled property and my next enabled property, because what that's going to do is those are the two buttons I was talking about earlier. Now, the next thing I need to do is update the data method, because the data method is what's going to return the currently selected item that's retrieved from the SharePoint list and those two properties to the adaptive card rendering engine. And the properties on this object are going to be bound to those specific elements in the adaptive card template that I just referenced. So what I'm going to do in here in this return statement, I'm going to set the previous enabled, and I'm getting the IntelliSense because I'm inheriting from my interface that I defined that implements the iList item. So I'm going to set this equal to the this.state. And one thing I get access to is the entire state of the component, which I defined in my adaptive card extension. And you remember we had one called current index. So I'm going to set the previous enabled, it's a Boolean property. I'm going to set it to be equal to if it's equal to 0. So if the current index is equal to 0, then that means we're at the beginning of the collection of items, and I don't want to have a previous button enabled. For the next enabled, the condition is a little bit different. I'm going to want to check to see if the current index is not equal to the list item's length minus 1. And then finally, I'm also, added an extra comma there. Finally, the last thing I want to do is I'm just going to want to add all the properties on the current item in the array that we're on using that current index. So I'd say this.state.listItems, this.state.current index, just like that. Oh, this should be length. There we go. Now let's add in a new method at the end of our component. And what this is going to be is our onAction method, because what this is going to do is this is going to define something that happens when a submit action happens. And if you remember, we have two submit actions. We have one for going to the previous item in the collection and one going to the next item in the collection. So here what I'm doing is I'm getting a reference to the current index, and I'm just going to take the current index, use the current index, and I'm just going to convert the string that was in that ID property for our action. I'm going to convert that to a number. And if you recall, that ID, the action's ID, that's going to be either a -1 or a +1 to indicate we're going forward or backward. Now, in this case, we should be able to test out our component. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to stop our web server and then restart it to get everything, make sure that everything gets built and displayed. And I saw an error pop up a second ago, and this one is strings declared never used in our quick view. So let's come back over to our quick view. And that's right, we're no longer using our dynamic string. So we'll just remove this from our method. And let's go back over to the browser and let's remove the existing web part that's on the page, or adaptive card extension that's on the page. I will then go back and re-add it. And notice here, we're now seeing we don't have a list ID. So I need to go through and paste in the list ID. So I'm going to put this in edit mode. I need to go fetch my list ID. I can do that by coming back over to my list. Let's go to our list settings page. And in the URL, we can see where we have a list, and that starts right after the %7b and goes all the way up to the %7D, because that is a URL encoded GUID with the curly brackets on either side of it. So I'm going to grab the ID from my list and we'll paste it in. There we go. And we can see that we made a call to the SharePoint REST API because whenever this property changed, we actually went and got the item or the title for our SharePoint list. So now if I put this into display mode, I should be able to select it. And there we can see our item 1, item 2, item 3. So there's our 3 items that we have listed here in our SharePoint list that we're just going back and forth through. And we're triggering this because we're using the on item selected. You can see that we still have our button here for displaying the same thing because we're using the button to display the same information, but that's not really all that important right here. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to add a new quick view to the items to the SharePoint list. And this is going to show us how to demonstrate how we can use the quick view to collect data from a form. So what I'm going to do is come back over to my project, and we'll stop the web server. And I'm going to add in a new file to my project. This is going to be a brand new quick view. So I'll go to the quick view folder and say new file, and it'll be the new item quick view. And let's just go ahead and let's paste in some code. So what does this have? So this code here, I've got a data method that's going to return nothing because we're not going to pass any data back to this one. The template, we're going to have to create that in just a minute. So let's go through and get ready to create that. I'll copy the file name. And then I have an on action method in there as well. You'll notice that the on action method, what it does is it gets some information from the input controls that are passed in. So I'm doing that like right here with the title and description that are passed in. I'm also using the data property. And then I'm going to go save the item by just calling add list item. Then once that happens, I'm then going to refresh the state to go get all the items in the SharePoint list, which will include the one that I just added, as well as any other ones that someone else has added during this time. And then I'm just going to close out my quick view navigator. So now I'll come over here to my template. Let's add in the JSON file that we're going to need to implement the form. I'll just save my changes there. And then to be able to use this, I need to go back and I need to register this with my quick view navigator. So I'm going to do that by coming back over to the page here. I'm going to say we're going to go over to our extension. I'm going to import the quick view navigator that we just created. I'm then going to come down and we'll add in a new export statement. So I'll put that right here. So this is basically just giving us an ID for our new item quick view that we're creating. And then the last step is going to be to then register it. So I'll do that right here. Just like this. Now, the last thing we want to do, now we've registered our quick view, is I want to change the card view so that the card view will be able to import this or be able to use this when someone clicks the button instead of just when they click the actual card. So I'm going to do that by coming back over here, and we're going to import our new quick item registry. And then I'll add in the view that we want to load using our quick view here. Actually, I only want to show this. Let's change this up a little bit. I want to say, actually, let's change the quick view here on strings. We'll say add item. Now that I don't think we're not using strings anymore. So we're going to go ahead and remove that strings reference. And what I want to do here is I want to say if this.properties.list ID, if that's not defined, then I want to return undefined, so no buttons show up. Otherwise, I want to, there we go, do it like that. Okay, so let's now test this out. So I'm going to rerun my the web server, and everything ran just fine. So now we're going to refresh the page. Okay, so we got our items. We'll go into display mode. Now we see our add item button that we changed it to. When I select it, I've got new items. So this is, I think, item 4. And another color will be black description, like that. I'll save my changes. If I go back to my SharePoint list, let's just confirm that we actually have our data. Sure enough, we just got a new item that just got created. And now if I go back and select my adaptive card, I should have item number 4 showing up as the black description item. So in this demo, you saw how we had created a SharePoint framework adaptive card extension with the basic card template that displayed items in a SharePoint list and enabled the user to add items to the list using a quick view.